During the Second World War, military officials regarded a particular piece of equipment as their most closely guarded secret. In its initial phase, this technology received higher security classification than even the atomic bomb program. Protection measures exceeded those surrounding the Allied invasion plans for Normandy. Military personnel maintained constant surveillance over these devices. Personnel who operated them took solemn vows of silence regarding its existence. Should an aircraft fall behind enemy lines, explicit commands demanded the equipment's destruction before crew evacuation. Historical records document instances where airmen perished while attempting to demolish these units with emergency axes as their burning planes descended. On a winter morning in early 1943, a precision bombing instrument occupied the forward compartment of an American heavy bomber flying high above occupied territory in Western Europe. The aircraft maintained an altitude exceeding for miles above the frozen landscape. Inside the nose section, a young sergeant served as the bombardier, his eyes fixed to the viewing apparatus of this classified device. Far below, through the frigid atmosphere, lay a crucial German manufacturing complex. Military intelligence indicated this facility supplied the majority of ball bearings for enemy war machinery. The briefing had been clear: eliminate this target and cripple the opponent's industrial capacity. The bombardier had undergone half a year of intensive instruction to master this instrument. Training materials claimed the device could achieve remarkable precision from extreme altitudes. The technical manual specified accuracy measurements that seemed almost impossible. His training officer at the air base in the American Southwest had required complete memorization of all technical specifications. This bombing computer could supposedly account for every conceivable variable: height above ground, velocity through air, lateral drift, atmospheric currents, even planetary rotation. Each unit cost more than multiple residential properties in rural regions of the United States during that period. Through the magnified optical system, the bombardier observed crosshairs moving across the European terrain below. The mechanical computer functioned as engineers had intended, continuously adjusting for countless factors, directing the heavy bomber toward the precise instant for weapon release. The device had assumed control of the aircraft through an indicator system connected to the pilot's instruments, making subtle adjustments to the plane's direction. The pilot could not override these commands during this critical phase. During the bombing approach, the bombardier effectively commanded the aircraft. The underlying theory possessed elegant simplicity. The bombardier would visually locate the objective through the device's eyepiece. He would input the current altitude from cockpit instruments. He would set their speed through the air. The mechanical computer, containing an intricate network of rotating components, balance platforms, and reflective surfaces, would determine the exact microsecond to release the payload, so explosives would follow a calculated arc and strike the designated location. At their current altitude, traveling at approximately 3 miles per minute, bombs required nearly a full minute to reach the surface. During that descent, winds would deflect them. Air thickness would influence their fall. The forward momentum from the aircraft would carry them. This device promised to factor every variable. The bombardier's finger hovered over the release mechanism. The targeting reticle approached the objective. The factory installation expanded within his field of vision. He could distinguish individual structures, exhaust stacks, railway connections. The automatic systems tracked smoothly. Everything operated precisely as designed. This represented the promised capability. This was precision aerial bombardment. This was America's intended method for winning the air campaign. Distinctly different from British tactics of nocturnal area saturation, dropping massive quantities of explosives across entire metropolitan zones, hoping some ordnance struck valuable targets. American military philosophy emphasized precision: strike manufacturing facilities, strike petroleum refineries, strike transportation infrastructure, destroy the enemy's capacity for warfare through surgical attacks on specific industrial objectives. This device made such doctrine feasible, or so military planners believed. In less than 1 minute, the bombardier would activate the trigger. Within 2 minutes, explosives would impact. Then they would discover whether the claims about this bombing instrument held true. The apparatus positioned in the nose of every American heavy bomber operating over Europe represented 20 years of engineering dedication. A Dutch-born engineer who immigrated to America shortly after the previous World War began developing bomb-aiming devices for naval aviation in the early 1920s. He possessed perfectionist tendencies. Convinced that any worthwhile endeavor deserved absolute precision, his initial attempts were rudimentary, but he comprehended the fundamental challenge better than contemporaries pursuing similar goals. An explosive dropped from an aircraft doesn't descend vertically. It retains the horizontal velocity of the releasing aircraft. It accelerates earthward according to gravitational laws. Wind forces deflect it laterally. Atmospheric resistance impedes descent in ways varying with altitude and temperature. Successfully striking a target from high altitude required solving intricate physics equations in real time, accounting for multiple simultaneous variables. Naval authorities provided funding and development time. Throughout the 1920s, he refined his designs. By the decade's end, he had constructed a prototype employing gyroscopic mechanisms to maintain platform stability regardless of aircraft motion. By the early 1930s, he had incorporated an analog computer capable of trajectory calculation. By mid-decade, he had added automatic flight control, permitting the bombsight to steer the aircraft during final approach, ensuring the bomber maintained exact heading and speed required by calculations. Army aviation tested this device in the mid-1930s. Results impressed every observer. During evaluation at a military proving ground in Maryland, bombardiers using this device consistently placed practice ordnance within 200 feet of targets from 10,000 feet altitude. Some drops landed within 50 feet. These accuracies exceeded what any other bomb site worldwide could achieve. Military aviation immediately classified the device. They recognized its potential value and understood that enemy acquisition of this technology would enable replication. Security surrounding the device became extreme. Each unit received a serial number for constant tracking. Bombardiers signed statements acknowledging potential court-martial for discussing the device with unauthorized personnel. The site was removed from aircraft between missions and stored in guarded vaults. By 1940, as conflict consumed Europe and America prepared for possible involvement, this device had become central to American bombing doctrine. Military aviation developed an entire strategic theory based on the device's capabilities. This theory was called precision daylight bombing, and it promised to revolutionize warfare. The concept appeared straightforward. Rather than dropping thousands of tons of explosives across entire cities at night, hoping to destroy industrial capacity through sheer volume, American bombers would operate during daylight when targets were visible. They would fly at high altitude, above 20,000 feet, where enemy anti-aircraft fire would be less accurate. Using this precision bomb sight, they would identify specific factories, refineries, and transportation centers. They would destroy these targets with minimal ordnance and minimal civilian casualties. This wasn't merely military strategy, it was moral doctrine. American military planners and politicians believed precision bombing was more ethical than area bombing. The British were already conducting massive nighttime raids on German cities, dropping incendiaries and high explosives across residential areas, killing thousands of civilians. American methods would be different. American methods would be precise. American bombers would hit military and industrial targets, not neighborhoods. This device made such precision possible. Each unit cost approximately $18,000 in 1940 currency. To provide perspective, a new house in rural America cost about $3,000. A new automobile cost $800. The heavy bomber itself cost approximately $238,000. This single instrument represented nearly 8% of the aircraft's total cost, an enormous investment in a single piece of equipment. but the investment seemed justified. If the device could do what it promised, if it could hit targets from 25,000 feet with the accuracy demonstrated in testing, then it was worth every penny. The young bombardier had never encountered anything like this precision instrument before reporting to training school at an airfield in Texas in mid-1942. The device sat on a table in a secured room. An armed guard stood outside. Students entered in small groups, never more than 6 at a time. The instructor, an officer who had been teaching candidates for 18 months, delivered the same speech to every class. This is the most advanced bombing instrument ever created. It is also the most secret. The enemy would sacrifice greatly to obtain one of these. You will never discuss this device with anyone unauthorized. You will never write about it in personal correspondence. If you are shot down over enemy territory, your first duty is to destroy this device before you bail out. Use the emergency axe. Smash the gyroscopes. Smash the mirror assembly. Set fire to it if possible. If you cannot destroy it completely, you will be held accountable. The training program lasted 18 weeks. Students learned ballistics physics, trajectory calculation mathematics, gyroscopic stabilization principles. They learned to identify targets from high altitude, distinguishing factory complexes from residential areas when both appeared as tiny rectangular clusters on the ground far below. They learned to account for weather, cloud cover, and the effects of temperature and barometric pressure on bomb fall. The device itself was a mechanical marvel. It weighed approximately 50 pounds and measured roughly 2 feet by 1 foot. The bombardier mounted it on a stabilizing platform in the aircraft's nose. When activated, the gyroscope spun up, creating a stable reference point independent of the aircraft's movement. The bombardier would look through the eyepiece and see the ground below magnified approximately 3 times normal vision. He would identify the target and center it in the crosshairs. He would dial in the altitude using a knob that fed information to the analog computer inside the device. He would set the airspeed. He would input the type of bomb being carried, because different bombs had different ballistic properties depending on their weight and shape. The computer would begin calculating. As the aircraft approached the target, the bombardier would track it in the eyepiece, keeping the crosshairs centered. The device would measure the rate at which the target appeared to move across the field of view. From this rate, combined with altitude and airspeed data, it could calculate the exact moment to release the bombs. The device would send signals to the pilot direction indicator in the cockpit, telling the pilot to turn left or right to maintain the precise heading needed. During the final 30 seconds of the bomb run, the bombardier could activate the automatic flight control system and the device would steer the aircraft directly through electrical connections to the autopilot. Students practiced on training ranges in the Texas desert. They flew at 10,000 feet, then 15,000, then 20,000 feet. They dropped 100-pound practice bombs filled with sand and watched observers on the ground measure the distance from impact point to target. Good bombardiers consistently achieved accuracies within 200 feet. The best achieved accuracies within 100 feet. The instructors emphasized one critical point repeatedly. The device was only as good as the bombardier using it. The device could perform perfect calculations, but if the bombardier misidentified the target or if he failed to keep the crosshairs centered during the approach or if he input incorrect altitude or airspeed data, the bombs would miss. This was a tool, a precise instrument, but it required a skilled operator. The bombardier graduated in December 1942. He scored in the top 15% of his class. They gave him wings and promoted him. In January 1943, he reported to a bomb group in England. 3 weeks later, he flew his first combat mission over occupied France. The first mission over Europe taught lessons the training manuals never mentioned. The device worked exactly as designed under one specific condition, when the bombardier could see the target clearly and keep it centered in the crosshairs for the entire bomb run. Combat made this almost impossible dart at 25,000 feet above Germany in January 1943. The temperature inside an unpressurized heavy bomber dropped to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The bombardier wore electrically heated flight gear, but his fingers still went numb within minutes of touching the metal components. The eyepiece itself became so cold that pressing his face against it risked frostbite. He learned to keep a cloth between his skin and the rubber padding. The aircraft's movement complicated everything. The bombers flew in tight formation with other aircraft, sometimes only 50 feet of wingtip clearance between aircraft. When enemy fighters attacked, the formation would shift. When anti-aircraft fire exploded nearby, the pilot would take evasive action. Each movement threw the carefully calculated tracking off course. The bombardier would lose sight of the target in the eyepiece and have to reacquire it, beginning the tracking process again. The device needed at least 90 seconds of stable flight during the final approach to calculate accurately. Combat rarely provided 90 seconds of stable flight. Anti-aircraft fire created another problem training if ever adequately addressed. German anti-aircraft batteries fired large shells set to detonate at specific altitudes. When they exploded near the bomber formation, they created clouds of black smoke and shrapnel fragments. These clouds obscured vision. The bombardier would track a target in his eyepiece, and suddenly a burst would bloom directly between his aircraft and the ground below. The target would disappear behind smoke. He would wait for the smoke to clear, try to reacquire the target, and discover that the aircraft's position had changed relative to the ground. The crosshairs were no longer centered. He would have to start over. The optical system itself had limitations that became apparent only in combat. The eyepiece magnified the ground approximately 3 times. This helped with target identification, but it also magnified atmospheric haze. On clear days with unlimited visibility, the device worked beautifully. On days with even moderate haze, the magnification made it harder to see targets, not easier. Industrial areas of Germany were perpetually covered in smoke from factories. The smoke mixed with natural haze to create visibility conditions that rendered precision bombing nearly impossible. Weather represented the most serious obstacle. The device required visual identification of the target. Cloud cover below the bomber formation meant the bombardier couldn't see the ground. European weather in winter featured clouds more often than clear skies. Mission planners would plan a raid on a specific factory based on weather forecasts, predicting clear conditions over the target. The bomber formation would fly 4 hours toward Germany. They would reach the initial point where they would begin their bomb run and clouds would cover the target area. The mission would be scrubbed or the formation would bomb an alternate target, or they would drop their bombs through clouds using dead reckoning navigation with no precision at all. Even on clear days, the human eye struggled to identify targets from 5 miles up. The training range in Texas featured markers painted on the desert floor, bright white circles surrounding the aiming point. German factories had no such markers. They looked like clusters of rectangular buildings. So did the neighborhoods surrounding them. Training had included target recognition, aerial photographs, and detailed briefings showing exactly what each factory looked like from altitude. In practice, one cluster of buildings looked remarkably similar to another cluster of buildings when viewed through a magnifying eyepiece from 25,000 feet through haze and smoke, while enemy fighters attacked and anti-aircraft shells exploded. Nearby. The bomb group flew missions throughout February and March 1943. The bombardier completed his first 10 missions. The results troubled him, although he didn't discuss his concerns with anyone. On August 17, 1943, the briefing room at the airfield filled with flight crews early in the morning. The operations officer pulled back the curtain covering the map on the wall. A ribbon stretched from England across the North Sea, across Holland, deep into southern Germany. The target was Schweinfurt, specifically the ball-bearing factories that produced components essential to German aircraft, tanks, and vehicles. The intelligence officer explained that these factories were critical targets. Destroy Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production, and Germany's entire military-industrial complex would grind to a halt within months. The mission planners expected this to be a turning point in the strategic bombing campaign. The formation took off mid-morning. 230 heavy bombers assembled over England and set course for Germany. The bombardier occupied his position in the nose. The device mounted and activated spinning gyroscopes. The flight across the North Sea was uneventful. Fighter escorts stayed with them across Holland. Then at the predetermined point, the fighters turned for home. The bombers continued east. German fighters appeared within minutes. They attacked in waves. They came from ahead, diving through the bomber formation, firing cannons. They came from the sides, making beam attacks that exposed vulnerable fuselages. They came from below, where defensive armament was weakest. The gunners fired continuously. Spent shell casings clattered across the flight deck. The stench of cordite filled the cramped spaces. Anti-aircraft fire began as they approached Schweinfurt. The Germans knew the bombers were coming. They had plotted the formation's course and positioned their batteries accordingly. Shells burst around the formation, creating black clouds of smoke and shrapnel. The bombardier heard metal fragments strike the aircraft's aluminum skin, sharp impacts that sounded like hail on a tin roof. The bomb run began. The bombardier pressed his face to the eyepiece. He tried to identify the target through smoke and haze. The factory complex was supposed to be visible, a distinctive cluster of buildings along a river. He saw haze. He saw what might have been buildings or might have been anything. The aircraft shook. Explosions occurred nearby. The pilot was taking evasive action, banking slightly, climbing, descending, doing anything to throw off German gunners' aim. Each movement threw his tracking off. He lost sight of whatever he thought he had identified as the target. The formation was breaking apart. Bombers fell out of formation trailing smoke. Engines on fire, crews bailing out. German fighters pressed their attacks with suicidal aggression. The sky filled with tracers, smoke, falling aircraft. The bombardier tried to focus on his task, tried to do his job, tried to make sense of what he could see through the eyepiece. He saw something that might have been the factory. He centered it in the crosshairs. The device began calculating. The aircraft shook from a near miss. He lost the target again. He reacquired what he thought was the target. The mechanisms tracked. The bombardier's hand went to the bomb release trigger. The lead bombardier in the formation released bombs. He saw the other aircraft's bombs fall away. He pressed his own trigger. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from the bomb bay. The bombs fell for 58 seconds. The bombardier didn't watch their impact. The instant the bombs released, the pilot banked hard and dove, breaking formation to escape the concentration over the target. German fighters followed them down. The crew fought their way back to England. They landed with 2 engines damaged, the tail section riddled with holes, and the bull turret gunner dead from fighter cannon fire. 60 bombers didn't return from Schweinfurt that day. 60 aircraft, 600 men. Some died over the target. Some crashed in Germany. Some made it partly back before damaged engines failed or wounded pilots lost consciousness. The force lost more than a quarter of the attacking aircraft in a single mission. The results reached the airfield 3 days later, when reconnaissance aircraft photographed Schweinfurt. Photo interpreters studied the images carefully. They counted bomb craters. They assessed damage to factory buildings. They compared the photographs to mission objectives. The ball-bearing factories were damaged, but not destroyed. Some buildings showed direct hits. More showed near misses. Many showed no damage at all. The bombs had fallen across a wide area. Some hit the factories. Some struck railroad yards half a mile away. Some struck residential neighborhoods. The precision bombing doctrine had called for surgical strikes against specific industrial targets. The reality was bombs scattered across several square miles of German territory. Post-mission analysis estimated that approximately 20% of bombs dropped fell within 1,000 feet of designated aiming points. 1,000 feet. Not the 75 feet promised in specifications. Not the 200 feet achieved on training ranges in Texas. 1,000 feet. And that was considered an acceptable result. The bombardier sat through the debriefing. He answered questions about what he had seen, what he had targeted, what the visibility conditions were like. He didn't mention that he wasn't entirely certain he had bombed the correct factory. He had bombed something. It might have been the ball bearing plant. It might have been something else. From 25,000 feet through smoke and haze, while explosions burst around the aircraft and fighters attacked, he simply couldn't be certain. Other bombardiers reported similar experiences. Some had seen the target clearly. Most had seen something that approximated the target based on briefing materials and aerial photographs. A few admitted they had dropped their bombs when the lead bombardier dropped his. Following standard procedure, when individual target identification proved impossible, the Schweinfurt raid was repeated in October 1943. The results were similar. Heavy losses among the bomber force, damage to the factories, but not destruction. Production continued. German ball-bearing output declined slightly, then recovered as the Germans dispersed, manufacturing to other facilities and repaired damaged buildings. The military commissioned studies to understand why precision bombing wasn't achieving the precision promised. The studies reached uncomfortable conclusions. The Bombsight worked exactly as designed under ideal conditions: clear weather, no enemy action, stable flight, experienced bombardier, perfect maintenance of the device. Combat rarely provided ideal conditions. Combat provided clouds, smoke, haze, freezing temperatures, enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, aircraft battle damage, crew fatigue, fear, and chaos. Under these conditions, the device's theoretical precision became theoretical indeed. The device could calculate trajectories with extraordinary accuracy, but if the bombardier couldn't see the target, or if he misidentified it, or if the aircraft's movement during evasive action disrupted the tracking, then perfect calculations meant nothing. The average bombing accuracy from 25,000 feet in combat conditions over Europe was approximately 1,200 feet from the aiming point. Some missions achieved better results. Many achieved worse. The circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of bombs fell, was typically between half a mile and 1 mile. The military never publicly acknowledged that the device failed to deliver the precision it promised. Security classifications remained in effect throughout the war. Bombardiers continued signing oaths never to discuss the device. Guards continued watching over the equipment between missions. The official narrative maintained that American precision daylight bombing was fundamentally different from and morally superior to British area bombing at night. The operational reality evolved quietly without fanfare or official announcements. By late 1943, bomber formations began using different tactics that tacitly acknowledged the device's limitations in combat. Instead of individual bombardiers selecting and bombing separate targets, formations would designate a lead bombardier. This officer, usually the most experienced available, would use his device to identify and track the target. When he released his bombs, the other bombardiers in the formation would release simultaneously, creating a pattern of bombs that saturated a larger area. This was called formation bombing or pattern bombing. The theory held that even if individual bombs missed the precise aiming point, the sheer number of bombs falling across an area would ensure that some hit the intended target. It was tactically sensible. It was also a fundamental departure from the precision bombing doctrine that justified the device's enormous cost and security classification. The bomb loads themselves changed. Early missions carried a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs designed to destroy specific structures. Later missions increasingly relied on incendiary bombs designed to start fires across wide areas. When bombing German cities with industrial facilities, the distinction between precision strikes on factories and area attacks on surrounding neighborhoods became difficult to discern from the ground. Both approaches resulted in large sections of cities burning. The Bombardier flew 35 missions between January and October 1943. He never achieved the accuracy he had been promised the device would deliver. His best bombing run, against a rail yard in France on a clear day, with minimal opposition, placed the bomb pattern within 400 feet of the aiming point. His worst runs, against targets obscured by clouds or smoke, might have missed by miles. He had no way to know for certain. After his 35th mission, he completed his combat tour and rotated back to the United States. The military assigned him to training command. He became an instructor at the same school where he had learned to use the device. He taught the same curriculum, demonstrated the same capabilities, made the same promises about precision that had been made to him. He never mentioned that combat conditions made those promises impossible to fulfill. The Air Force continued operations over Europe throughout 1944 and into 1945. Bombing accuracy improved marginally as crews gained experience, as fighter escorts became available for missions deep into Germany, and as German air defenses weakened under sustained assault. But the improvement came from overwhelming force, from sending 800 bombers where earlier they had sent 200, from saturating targets with such quantities of explosives that precision became less important than volume. By the final year of the war in Europe, American bomber formations were dropping tonnages comparable to British area bombing rates. The moral distinction that precision bombing was supposed to provide had eroded in practice, even while it remained intact in official doctrine and public statements. Cities like Dresden, attacked by both British and American bombers in February 1945, were devastated by firestorms that made no distinction between factories and residential areas, between military targets and civilian neighborhoods. The device continued to be used, continued to be classified, continued to require armed guards and security protocols. The device functioned as designed. It simply couldn't deliver precision under the conditions that actually existed in combat. No bombsight could have delivered that precision. The promise had been based on peacetime testing under ideal conditions extrapolated to wartime application, where ideal conditions never existed. After the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive analysis of the bombing campaign's effectiveness. Teams of analysts visited hundreds of German cities and industrial sites. They interviewed German factory managers, examined production records, photographed damage, and attempted to determine what the strategic bombing campaign had actually accomplished. The survey's findings were sobering. German war production had continued to increase through 1944, despite the sustained bombing campaign. Ball-bearing production, the target of the Schweinfurt raids and numerous other missions, had declined temporarily after major attacks, but had recovered quickly as the Germans dispersed manufacturing and repaired facilities. Oil production, another priority target, had been affected more significantly, but only after sustained attacks beginning in mid-1944, when improved fighter escort allowed bombers to strike with less interference. The survey estimated that approximately 20% of bombs dropped on Germany fell within 1,000 feet of their designated aiming points, in urban areas where targets were surrounded by other buildings and infrastructure. This meant that 4 out of 5 bombs struck something other than the intended target. The bombs still caused damage. They destroyed buildings, disrupted transportation, killed workers, and forced the Germans to divert resources to air defense and reconstruction. But they didn't achieve the surgical precision that the device and the doctrine of precision daylight bombing had promised. The survey's analysis of specific factories revealed patterns that troubled American military planners. Factories that had been reported as destroyed in post-mission reconnaissance often proved to be damaged but operational. The Germans had become experts at dispersing critical machinery, at camouflaging important structures, at repairing damage quickly. A factory that appeared devastated from aerial photography might be producing again within weeks. The human cost of the bombing campaign was enormous on both sides. 50,000 American airmen died in combat over Europe. Tens of thousands more were shot down and captured. German civilian casualties from bombing exceeded 500,000 dead, with millions more injured or displaced. The strategic bombing campaign was the most expensive and destructive air campaign in history to that point. The device itself became a study in the gap between engineering excellence and operational effectiveness. As a mechanical analog computer, it was genuinely remarkable. The device could perform complex ballistic calculations with accuracy that matched or exceeded early electronic computers developed later in the war. The gyroscopic stabilization system was ingenious. The optical system was well designed. The integration with the aircraft's autopilot was sophisticated for its time. But none of this mattered if the bombardier couldn't see the target, or if he misidentified it, or if enemy action prevented the stable flight path the device required. The device was optimized for a type of warfare that didn't exist. It assumed clear weather, visual target identification, and unimpeded bomb runs. Combat over Germany provided clouds, smoke, anti-aircraft fire, and fighters. After the war, the security classifications were gradually lifted. By the early 1950s, the device was declassified. Historians and journalists began examining the bombing campaign with access to data that had been secret during the war. The gap between the device's promise and its actual performance became public knowledge. The engineer himself maintained until his death in 1965 that his Bombsight was the most accurate device of its kind ever created. He was correct in purely technical terms. Under ideal conditions, the device performed exactly as specified. His era, and the era of the military planners who built an entire strategic doctrine around the device, was assuming that ideal conditions bore any relationship to combat reality. The accuracy claimed in demonstrations was real. The demonstrations simply bore no resemblance to bombing a factory in Germany from 25,000 feet while under attack. The bombardier returned to civilian life in 1946. He never spoke publicly about his experiences. The device remained classified 4 years after the war, and the habits of secrecy persisted long after the formal need for security ended. He kept his wings and medals in a drawer. He told his children he had served in the Air Forces during the war, but he offered few details about what he had done. In the 1980s, decades after the war, military historians began interviewing surviving bomber crew members for oral history projects. The bombardier agreed to one interview. He was asked about the device and whether it had lived up to its reputation. His answer was careful, measured, the response of a man who had spent 40 years thinking about the question. The device was a magnificent piece of engineering, he said. Under the right conditions, it could do everything they said it could do. The problem was that we never had the right conditions. We had weather and explosions and fighters and smoke and haze and fear. We did the best we could with what we had. Sometimes that was good enough. Often it was, and single quotes did. The interviewer pressed him about the claims of extreme accuracy, about the promises that precision bombing would change warfare. His response deserves attention, as it represents one of the few candid assessments from someone who actually used a device in combat. They told us we could achieve incredible accuracy from extreme altitude. Maybe somebody did once on a test range in perfect weather with no one shooting at them. I never saw it happen in combat. Most of the time, we were lucky if we hit the right city. The device was a tool. It was a good tool, but it couldn't work miracles, and we needed miracles to do what they asked us to do. The device represented something larger than a single piece of military equipment. It represented American faith in technology, in engineering solutions to complex problems, in the belief that superior tools could overcome difficult circumstances. This faith was not entirely misplaced. American technology, American industrial capacity, and American engineering did contribute significantly to Allied victory in World War II. But this story demonstrates the limits of technology when applied to the chaos of combat. The device that had been too expensive, too secret, too advanced for the enemy to be allowed to capture proved to be less revolutionary than promised. After the war, When American intelligence officers examined German and Japanese bomb sites, they found devices that were nearly as capable, developed independently, and at far lower cost. The security that had seemed so critical, the guards and the oaths and the procedures for destruction, had protected a technological advantage that was narrower than anyone realized. The $18,000 device that promised to hit targets from 25,000 feet in daylight achieved that precision only under conditions that rarely existed in war. When the bombardier pressed his face to the eyepiece that morning over Schweinfurt in January 1943, he was using the most advanced bombing technology in the world. He was also discovering that advanced technology couldn't overcome smoke, clouds, anti-aircraft fire, fighters, fear, and the fundamental chaos of industrial warfare. The bombs fell. Some hit their targets, most didn't, and the war continued, decided not by precision, but by overwhelming force, by industrial capacity, by the sheer volume of men and material that America and its allies could bring to bear against their enemies.